Okay, so hello and welcome back. And to open this video up, we're going to be going over um, Colorado Eagle, which was the St. Louis to Denver train over the Missouri Pacific. And before we get too far into this, I am just realizing I forgot to put in a background screen. So, anyways, I'll just go over the outline um, right now. So, we're going to be going over the early years of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, how it became a strong regional player in Missouri and Texas, like the Southern Pacific was in California. Um, the history of the Missouri Pacific is very dense, so I won't be able to go over all of it in one video. So it'll be sprinkled through several videos about the Missouri Pacific. And, they've gone through a lot of bankruptcies and reorganizations. And the main outline of this presentation is going to be like a little glimpse into the early history of the Missouri Pacific, the creation of its eagles, the Colorado Eagle itself, and the decline of the Missouri Pacific passenger service, and a brief mention of the Scenic Limited. So the Missouri Pacific started out as one of the Pacific railroads that was chartered to connect St. Louis with California, and part of this railroad would become the Texas and Pacific Railroad that would connect to the SP at El Paso. One interesting thing about the Missouri is that despite St. Louis and Kansas City not being Chicago and constantly being reminded of that fact, it's that it actually had the most railroad connections between them than any other two cities in the U.S. At its height, there were actually 19 different rail lines between the two and 11 on average over time. Following the mega merger era, this number is down drastically. Now there's at least two direct main lines between the cities and various other ways you can get between them, but from what I can tell looking at the maps, there's at least two direct connections. So yeah, and because of how dense the rail network is in the area, it's not hard to route stuff around. Anyways, the first railroad was chartered in 1849 and started building west. Following the Civil War, the railroad that was constructed was split into two parts. The southwestern branch became the modern Missouri Pacific, and the northern branch became the Frisco Railroad. Not long after the railroads were split was when Jay Gould got involved. Also, no idea if this is pronounced Gould, like, snake creatures from Stargate, or is it good, as in you just, wood. So even to this day, still don't know how to pronounce his name. Not going to look it up because no matter which way I pronounce it, people will be mad. So just rolling with it. Pronunciation's a weird thing in English for the few foreign viewers I have. So yeah, English pronunciation, it's a mess even for us. Anyways, this is also the time when the Missouri Pacific became a big regional system. And this was also at a period in time when many major regional railroads that were a part of the good system took their modern forms, quote unquote. This including the Wabash, the Katy, the Rio Grande, the Western Pacific. The main railroads that became part of the Missouri Pacific were the Katy, the International and Great Northern, St. Louis and Iron Mountain, and the Texas and Pacific. This system would enable him to dominate Texas until the Santa Fe entered in 1887. So at this point, the Missouri Pacific was more or less comparable to the Southern Pacific of Texas. Their equivalent railroad. It wasn't actually the SP, because the SP would show up a lot later in history. Not a lot later, but a few decades later. Or was it a one decade? I can't remember exactly. Also in this period is when the Missouri Pacific was forced to sell off the Katy on competitive grounds. As for opening of the Missouri Pacific into Colorado, I'm not really sure when this happened. All I know is it started running the Scenic Limited to Oakland over the Rio Grande and the Royal Gorge route and the Western Pacific in 1915. As mentioned in the video about the California Zephyr, this was a heavyweight train, and this train was also exchanged with the newly launched Colorado Eagle in 1942 under wartime restrictions. The Missouri Pacific, here's the map by the way, couldn't run two trains, so they exchanged the diesel-powered lightweight Colorado Eagle for the steam-powered heavyweight Scenic Limited. So on the map, the light blue line is the route of the Texas Eagle, Colorado Eagle. Sorry, I got that on the brain. And the orange line is out of the Scenic Limited. The Scenic Limited went through the Royal Gorge route rather than through the Moffett Tunnel route, which is the route of the California Zephyr. And it made the transcontinental connection between Oakland and St. Louis. So yeah, I also that's also another thing though. In the video about the California Zephyr, I mentioned not knowing when exactly the Scenic Limited stopped running. The answer is 1942, during the World War II. Anyways, little bit brief background on the Eagles themselves. They were the flagship trains of the Missouri Pacific, and they were the equivalent of the Daylights and the Chiefs. The name for the Eagles were chosen by a poll of employees of the Missouri Pacific. They chose the name Eagle because, to quote, I think it was the employee newspaper at the time, the eagle, swift, graceful, powerful, and since the creation of our republic, the symbol of American progress. The first Eagle ran in 1939 and grew to be a fleet that connected the southern Midwest and some of the South and Southwest. Other Eagle trains included the Aztec Eagle between St. Louis and Mexico City, the Valley Eagle between Houston and Brownsville, the Texas Eagle between St. Louis and El Paso, and the Missouri River Eagle between St. Louis and Omaha. The Missouri Pacific was a curious railroad. It had a substantial schedule of mostly streamlined trains well into the 1960s. Some trains were still running 4 times per day, which was actually fairly unusual for most trains of that time period. Which is also a thing that editorial part here is that as much as people like saying that like passenger train just like completely died, it actually took a while, and not every railroad killed their trains off as quickly. The Missouri Pacific was also pretty bad towards the end of private passenger service in this country, but there was a time like some other railroads where they did try to hold on to their passenger trains and try to make the best of it. So most railways were not like the Southern Pacific and the Chicago and Northwestern that basically just ran their trains into the ground. Some of them tried to make do until they couldn't, and other ones like the Santa Fe and the UP did try to keep them going to the highest standard they could at the time. And a little preview, we'll be getting into that in a future video as part of the urbanism series whenever I release part 2 of that. So the Colorado Eagle was a route that attempted to get out the door by the time World War II started. As mentioned earlier, the train replaced the Scenic Limited between St. Louis and Oakland and was carried between Pueblo and Denver by the Rio Grande. There was still the capacity to get to Oakland over this train through the Royal Gorge route, at least post-World War II. I will also note that St. Louis was a major rail hub at one point in its history in its own right. There were fewer trains through St. Louis than there were through Chicago, but it still had a lot of service. For example, you get to like Dallas, Houston, El Paso, Memphis, New Orleans, St. Paul, Seattle, Denver, Oakland, LA, and probably a lot of other cities that I haven't mentioned. Oh yeah, New York was also another big one, and as well as the whole Northeast corridor rather. And at one point, St. Louis Union Station was actually the busiest station in the U.S., and it remained that way for several decades. And so compared to today, that's a huge difference. And when it sees barely a dozen trains per day, let alone being the busiest in the country. So although Chicago may have had more trains, it still was one of the biggest rail hubs in the country, and people tend to forget that. Again, future video topic probably. So as mentioned, the Colorado Eagle was launched and was one of the last of the Eagles. And nope, skipped ahead a little bit. And then it got running in 1942 and was one of the last of the Eagles to start running. These trains were designed by Raymond Loewy, who came up with the cream, blue, yellow, and silver design, and the dark blue interior, which was featured in the dining car. One note on the dining car, and let me actually skip ahead to that menu, is this is actually a menu from the Missouri Pacific and the Colorado Eagle in general during World War II. And even during the depths of World War II, this menu still managed to have 8 meal options over here, and this is the silver platter breakfast, which are the meal options. Some of these are cereal and a little bit lighter fare, but again, I count them, for the sake of they're on the meal list. Given that the schedule for the Colorado Eagle was primarily an overnight train between St. Louis and Denver, I don't think they really put on that extravagant of a food service. The schedule at this time for both trains, they left their termini around 4 p.m. for the westbound train and arrived at 10 a.m. And the eastbound train reached St. Louis around noon. And also another point is I have no idea why some trains had discrepancies like that. Between its east and westbound counterparts. I know that like planes do because of the jet stream, but I don't really know why trains sometimes have that. And if anyone knows why there's like weird like 2 hour like extra paddings in some directions of trains, please tell me no. Is it just a weird scheduling thing that just happened, or is there a better reason for it? Because again, I know why planes, if they're flying against the jet stream, why their schedules are longer, because it actually is harder for them to move because of the jet stream versus going with it. So I know that's why westbound flights tend to be a little bit longer, but again, why are like trains different? Because I don't think the jet stream matters on the ground, right? But anyways, if you know in the comments, please let me know. And here's the other side of the breakfast menu, which is the a la carte menu, which basically every train menu had at the time. It have its meals and its a la carte options. So again, very well filled out menu even for 1944. Before we get into the decline, we're actually going to talk a little bit about the train in more depth. So the consist of the Eagle was 3 sleepers, some number of coaches, and then there was also another sleeper which ran to Wichita, and a dining car and lounge also was on the train. I also have no idea how many coach cars were in the consist. My guess is at most 3, given that trains generally at this point would have about as many sleepers as coaches, or at least whatever their standard sleeper was. Like, so if it was like a 10-6, if there were 3 10-6s, there was usually 3 coaches and then some other number of sleepers. And other note is that 10-6s were not like a standard sleeper size, or not the standard, quote unquote. They were a common design, yes, but they were it's kind of associated and assumed that that was the most standard sleeping design, just because Amtrak kept most of them, or at least all the ones it got. There were other common sleeper designs too at the time, but it was just the one we remember most because it was the one that lasted the longest. Anyways, that little sidebar over. Let's just get on to it. After World War II, the train was given a dome car, which the Missouri Pacific called planetarium domes, which were built by Budd, and the Missouri Pacific contracted to Pullman for most of its staff and other trains. And also, a little thing I have to mention with some conflicting information. According to one source, it was a quote-unquote all-Pullman train until 1964, and another source mentions that it had coaches after World War II. All I will say is that I found one of their schedules from 1946 that mentions it having coach cars, and since it was too soon after World War II for them to conceivably get new equipment, and since it was a secondary train, it probably wouldn't have been high on the list of priorities anyways. My guess is that it was never a quote-unquote all Pullman service, meaning it was all sleeping cars, and that not being an all Pullman service is probably a reference to either A, losing some of its Pullman staffing, or starting to lose sleeping service altogether, which was a thing that started happening. So anyways, let's get into the decline of the Colorado Eagle. 1964 was a turning point for the Colorado Eagle, as well as most of the Missouri Pacific passenger trains. Along with no longer being serviced by Pullman, as far as I can tell, it lost its sleeping cars and its main dining car service. And a side note, this also could be the reference to losing all Pullman status that the one source references, meaning it losing its sleeping car service. But anyways, not long after its first downgrade, it was downgraded again. It was stripped of its name and truncated to Kansas City, Denver only train. And this is basically the state it would stay in until the creation of Amtrak. And then like half of the trains that came under the like umbrella and responsibility of Amtrak, it was one of those trains that just wasn't retained when one service started in 1971. And the winter of 1964 was when the Missouri Pacific also, as mentioned, was trying to cut back a lot of its services. By 1966, they were down to about a dozen routes running once a day, and only 3 of which were named. And this was similar to the Rock Island, which kind of had a steady state of service going until it started cutting deeply in 1966 after the losing of the mail contracts. So, this was the Colorado Eagle. It was the, again, train that went from St. Louis to Denver, over the Missouri Pacific and the Rio Grande. And I just wanted to thank you for listening, and we're getting close to the end of the Denver-centric videos, and then the next one, which is the Texas Zephyr, will be the last of them, and then after that we'll be moving into Texas-based stuff, and that will actually include a few more station videos, which are on the drawing board but not made as of yet, so we'll just have to see where those go. So I thank you for watching and hope you did enjoy. And I don't really mention this at the end of videos, but yeah, do the YouTube things of liking, commenting, subscribing, saying whatever. So, anyways, I hope you do enjoy, and I hope you are enjoying the newer format. This is actually quite a bit easier to make videos in, even though it yeah, we'll save that for a Q&A video whenever they come, because I might hit a subscriber milestone by then. So anyways, I will see you in the next one.